So, what I want to do today is to talk about something which is quite different from what we've talked about up to this point in the course, which is to give you a sense of how scholars think not only about what is in the world and what they want to explain, but also how they try to think about what ought to be. And so this is one of the fundamental distinctions that we have in international affairs is the distinction between explanation and argument about the way that things ought to be. So the first part of this that I want to do is to give you I want to give you a rough sense of what ethics are in international relations, how it is that people think about the ethics of what you ought to do and ought not to do. And secondly, I want to think about this in the context of a particular set of questions which arises for international politics, which are the questions around migration. That is, the questions around the circumstances under which people may move from one country to another, and how we think about migration turns out to have some very important normative consequences, which is a fancy way of saying that the ways in which we think about it reflect the values that we hold and reflect the ways in which we might try to realize these values in a complex world. This does entail a very significant shift of gears. Up to now, we have emphasized theories that focus primarily on explanation. So we have looked at realism, for example. Realism is a theory of the world which emphasizes the role of states. States are the key actors, according to realists. It also emphasizes the fears that states have for their own survival, the suspicions that they plausibly have of other states, and hence emphasizes the ways in which they are very likely to look to self-help in order to try to get along in life and in order to try and protect and defend themselves from a variety of possible important threats. We've also talked about liberalism, which takes a more benign view of things and tends to focus instead on how states find themselves in an anarchic world, which means that it's complicated and difficult to solve certain kinds of problems. And so liberals, of course, as we have discussed at length during the course, this leads them to think about how states might want to construct a variety of institutions that would help them to cooperate by giving them expert information, by telling them about what states are doing, and by providing them with the means to, effectively, collectively or individually work so as to punish states which default from, for example, solving a variety of collective action problems. And finally, we've looked at constructivism. And constructivism is about, in a sense, it is about norms, it is about ethics much of the time, but it seeks primarily to look at these as tools of explanation. In other words, constructivists don't necessarily tell you directly what they want you to do in the world. Instead, they look at how it is that, say, for example, the spread of human rights norms across the world might affect the way in which states and other actors behave towards each other. So those are all theories that focus primarily, although as I will say, not exclusively on explanation. What they want to do is they want to explain what causes what in the world. And what I want to do today is instead to focus on theories that involve discussing ethics and justification. That is questions of, to put it at its simplest, questions of right and wrong. So questions that you might ask if you were a realist or a liberal or constructivist might be, for example, why do states behave in the way that they behave? Whereas questions that you might want to ask if you're interested in international ethics might have more to do with it might be questions such as, ought states behave in this kind of way, given the norms, given the sense of right or wrong that I hold as being plausible, and what is the right thing for a state or another actor to do in a given situation. So this is not about explanation, it is about justification, which is to say that it is about figuring out what actions are right and what actions are wrong in a given particular sense. So this is, of course, a distinction that philosophers and others talk about somewhat in the crudest version as being the distinction between ises and oughts. Some things are about ises, some questions involve ises, so that is that you're trying to figure out, you're trying to explain something, and some questions involve oughts, which are things where you are trying to figure out what one ought to do in a given situation. So this is the difference between what is sometimes called positive theory and normative theory. Positive theory are theories which explain the world, and normative theories are theories that tell you what you ought to do in a given situation under a given set of circumstances, given the appropriate norms, the appropriate principles that are there to provide you with ethical guidance. Now, as I say, realism, liberalism, and constructivism tend primarily to be positive theories, that is, theories of explanation, rather than normative theories, but each of them has some degree of suppressed normative elements to them. So realism, if we think about it, this is a theory in a sense about how we live in a world in which the right does not prevail very often, but that also leads to a kind of a tragic understanding of our human condition, in which realists who think about it very often do not seek to deny the power of ethics. They just say that it is very, very hard to figure out ways to behave ethically in a world which is cruel and in a world which is subject to all of these disagreements. Liberals obviously do have a strong tendency to go together in their explanations with liberal theories. So there are a variety of liberal theories that are put forward by philosophers such as John Rawls, who we will discuss later, and it is not always entirely possible to separate liberals' explanations of the world from the normative oughts that inform those explanations in the background. And finally, constructivists who talk about norms a lot very often tend to subscribe to specific norms, and there is a not universal but a pretty broad generalization that one can say that most constructivists tend to be on the left side of the political spectrum rather than the right side of the political spectrum, even more than is true of most political scientists. So those are in effect, the theories that we have talked about today, up to today, they do have these normative elements to them, but their normative elements are by and large suppressed in favor of talking about explanation. We are going to, rather than doing that, we're going to go to the opposite extreme. We are going to focus on the ethical elements of different approaches to and different understandings of the world, rather than the explanatory factors. And so I'm going to do this in a kind of a complicated way, which I hope is going to provide you with some guidance, because there are two different things that I wanted to bring together. One is the abstract or somewhat abstract theories, and the other is the factual situations that we might want to apply the theories to. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to first of all give you a very brief and extremely sketched out, extremely minimal understanding of how we might want to think about ethics in the international realm and how we might want to apply ethical questions. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that and talking about how these theories might plausibly work. Now, I should be clear, I am not a philosopher, I am not a political theorist. You would get a very different and much more substantial account of these things if you took a class in political theory or a class in philosophy, and I do recommend there are some wonderful people here who teach in both of these areas. So I know sort of colleagues of mine such as Ingrid Krapell and Sam Goldman, both of whom offer courses here that if you have the opportunity to take them, you really should take them. So, so I'm not going to deal with it at that level. I'm just going to give you the very simplest version of this, which can provide you with some kind of guidance to how we think about these broad questions. Then, after we've spent time talking about how ethics works in the international realm, giving you some of the key questions at least that we might want to think about, we can then go on to talk about the specific cases that we might want to apply these theories to. And in particular, we will look at migration. We will look at how migration, the movement of people across borders, how this provides a set of complicated and thorny and difficult ethical questions which you might want to resolve in different ways depending upon the particular values you have. And I will talk about migration in the international realm. Here I will draw upon readings which I have not assigned to you because there's only so much reading you can do. And then we will talk briefly about how it is that this applies in the United States and in Europe, both of which are facing a set of important ethical questions about migration at the moment. And we'll talk about the different ethical answers that different understandings of our ethical obligations might provide us with. And I will make it clear, and I should say this at the beginning, so this is not going to be a class where I'm going to tell you what to think. I'm not going to tell you which of these approaches is the appropriate way for you to, the appropriate set of values for you to adopt, because frankly, that is not my job as a teacher. My job as a teacher is not to tell you that this is the right way to think about this ethically and this is the wrong way. Instead, it is to give you the tools to help perhaps to analyze a little bit more clearly your own ethical positions and what implications those ethical positions entail, because that really is, I think the most that a teacher like me can reasonably do is to give you a sense that no matter what your ethical position is on these questions, there are going to be, there are going to be questions you need to ask, and every ethical question, every ethical approach that you might want to adopt, there are going to be some awkward questions that might be posed by complex issues such as migration. And we will talk about this at some length. So first of all, if we want to think about how the world works, and if we want to think about how ethics work, there are a variety of very important questions that we need to ask in order to get to a place where we can analyze this appropriately. So first question is, so you might want to think about how it is that if we think about ethics, typically when we think about ethics, they involve obligations that we have. Ethics typically involve us being obliged in some way to take into account the interests of others than ourselves when we are taking certain kinds of decisions. One could, of course, have an ethic of complete self-interest, but that would be probably not an extraordinarily interesting ethic under most circumstances. So who do we owe obligations to? And obviously the answer to that question varies a lot across cultures, it varies a lot across individuals, and it varies a lot across periods of history. So who we owe obligations to? There has been, of course, for many centuries, there has been a standard answer to this across a variety of the monotheistic religions, which is that the primary actor who we owe obligations to is God. So this is a standard kind of argument that you will see in Christian religions, you will see this in Islam, you will see this in Judaism, is this sense that we owe obligations to God to behave in certain kinds of ways, and these obligations effectively are grounded in our relationship to the divine. So typically these obligations then have consequences for the ways in which we behave towards others, but they are typically grounded in the fundamental notion that we owe the obligation to God. So you could also think about other kinds of obligations that people have had and sometimes continue to have. Another possible obligation is that we might owe obligations to superiors. If we are in the armed forces, there is a chain of command, and typically there is a strong sense that you owe a strong obligation to obey your superior officers, even if you think that your superior officers are fools, except under certain specific circumstances. Say, for example, if your officer is commanding you to behave in some way that is actively illegal or is a war crime, then obviously your obligation stops there, but nonetheless you have a variety of very broad obligations. Similarly, if you think about the arguments about the divine right of kings, This was an argument for who we owe obligations to, which combined this notion of a final obligation to God with a more specific obligation to the king or the royal actor who ruled us, and who in a sense had this divine right to rule us because he or she, mostly he in history, had been given that right by virtue of the divine order which his or her rule represented in the temporal realm. More modern, quote-unquote, approaches to obligation often stress our obligations to fellow citizens, that we have key obligations as citizens, many of us, most of the people in the class, but certainly not everybody. We have obligations as citizens of the United States of America to other citizens. If you are a citizen of another country, you plausibly may owe obligations under many theories to the citizens of those other countries. And if you have dual citizenship, well, so if you owe obligations to both and you find yourself in a complicated situation, if you're two countries that you owe obligations to go to war with each other. Some people say that this concept of obligation to citizenship isn't nearly enough, that we should think about obligations to humanity as a whole, that we owe our obligations to all other human beings. Other people stress our obligations to those in our family. It is a near universal among human cultures that people think that you owe more substantial obligations to your parents, to your siblings, to others, to your children, of course, than you do to strangers who you have no direct relationship with. And there are many people who argue that we owe ethical obligations to animals, so that, for example, we shouldn't eat them, or we should not use products which are made from them, or we should, under other understandings, we should make sure that they are treated humanely in a variety of ways. So these are all different notions of what obligations actually involve. So that is a whole set of thorny questions, but of course it isn't the only set of thorny questions we might want to ask. We might also think about what kinds of obligations do we owe them. Saying that we owe obligations in some abstract way to somebody doesn't tell you what are the obligations that you do and do not have. It could be that you just owe them the obligation to respect their autonomy. That is, not to interfere with their efforts to try and pursue life, liberty, and happiness as best as they can. That is a specific and somewhat limited set of obligations. You might have stronger obligations. You might have obligations to support other people in some active ways, so providing them with physical help or succor. You might owe them obedience if they are hierarchical superiors. Again, this is something that is important. You might have some obligation to owe them friendship, to owe them something which is not just obedience, not just support, but a active and lively sentiment of deep obligation and of mutual support and enjoyment with them. Or you might even feel that you owe them the obligation of love. This is a obligation, for example, in Christianity, is that you're supposed to love those around you, to love your neighbor as yourself. So these are all obligations that you plausibly might or might not be expected to owe to people. You also face problems because typically in the real world, the abstract sounding obligations that you have and the actors you have obligations to turn out to be complicated. And very often our values and our obligations may clash. So that, for example, you might have some obligation to protect the common good, but this might come into some contradiction with your reasonable desire to preserve yourself and to preserve your life. Under what circumstances can you value self-preservation over the common good? This is a classic question that many theorists and philosophers have asked. Thomas Hobbes, for example, has this very interesting argument about the formation of a commonwealth, which effectively starts from the notion that individuals have a fundamental right to preserve themselves. You might also want to think about the question of obedience versus obligation to others. If you are required to obey certain rules, to obey certain orders that are lawfully given, but these cause you to behave in ways that perhaps are in conflict with obligations you feel that you owe to others. How do you deal with this? And there are a variety of such conflicts that inevitably emerge. So another set of questions that inevitably emerges for an ethicist is thinking about, when you have these different clashing obligations, how do you resolve the clashes? And there is a variety of ways in which you might want to do this. You might want to look to religious texts. Again, this is a classical way of thinking about things. You could think here about Judaism and the Midrash, and the way in which you have not only religious texts, but a huge body of commentary on how to apply those religious texts to a variety of specific conflicts and circumstances. You might think about constitutions. Constitutions typically have statements of values and have rules and have specialized actors, judges at the Supreme Court in the United States in the final instance, who are supposed to resolve potential clashes between different values. You might have norms, more informal ways of doing this. And finally, there is, in the international realm, there is international law. So these are the basic normative questions that you will begin to start to want to investigate if you are interested in ethics in the world. And if you're interested specifically in international relations, so we could start by asking, from an international relations perspective, who do we owe obligations to? And here it might be useful to look at a variety of different perspectives that we have in the world today. And these are, in a sense, so there are other perspectives than these, but these, I think, are key perspectives that help to structure many of the debates and arguments and fights that we have over ethics and international affairs. So if we think, who do we owe obligations to? And if we live in a global world, we're likely to see a big clash between two different approaches that you might call nationalists and cosmopolitans. So here, nationalists would plausibly, nationalists are those who believe that the key actors who we owe obligations to are our fellow nationals. They are fellow citizens of the country that we inhabit. They have some kind of an ethnic or a political identity, or a mixture of those two kinds of identities that they share with us, and that these are that effectively the key actors to whom we owe obligations are our fellow nationals. And here then, by implication, this downplays your obligations to those who are located in other countries, or those who have no countries to call their own. That it's not to say that nationalists don't believe that you have any obligations to others than your fellow nationals, but most nationalists believe that there is a strong distinction between the kind of obligations you owe to your fellow citizens, your fellow nationals, and the kind of which are reasonably strong obligations, and the obligations you owe to everybody else, which might plausibly be much weaker. But nationalism is not the only possible approach to understanding this. So you can imagine that there are other people who also think about themselves as being cosmopolitans. And cosmopolitans, cosmopolitans is, roughly speaking and very crudely translated from the Greek. Polis is the word for a city or for a political unit, and cosmos is the word for an order, or for more or less everything that you can see. So cosmopolitan is somebody who treats everybody as being a member of the same political unit as they are, or in other words, is somebody who looks at the world and says that my fundamental obligations are to fellow human beings, regardless of the nationality that they have. And here, by implication then, if you are a cosmopolitan, you may feel that you have some particular obligations to your fellow nationals that you don't have to other people, but by and large you tend to de-emphasize those obligations to fellow nationals in favor of obligations that you owe to other people in the world, and you tend to think that you by and large have strong obligations to people no matter where they live, no matter what their nationality is. You believe that that is the appropriate set of actors. Humanity as a whole is the appropriate set of actors to whom you owe obligations. Now, these are not the only ways in which you could carve this up, so that, for example, you might imagine that people who have a specific religion might feel that they owe particular obligations to co-religionists, regardless or not of whether those co-religionists are fellow nationals or are located elsewhere. And you can think about this, so if you can think about this with regard to Islam, to Judaism, to Christianity, all of these religions tend to have a specific sense that you have something in common with other co-religionists, no matter where they are located, and hence that you have some degree of special obligation to them. Obviously, that the extent of obligation varies across time, varies across circumstance, and varies across religious community to a greater or lesser degree. There are other approaches. So if you think about Marxists in the 19th and early 20th century, often they believed that they owed their obligation to the international proletariat, although notoriously it turned out that very quickly the obligations that they felt they owed to the international proletariat tended to collapse in favor of a sense of strong nationalism as a way of organizing the working class, and so hence many of the strong international and quasi-cosmopolitan flavors of Marxism tended to collapse to Marxism within a particular state during the period in which the Soviet Union and other Marxist states were significant players in the world. So all of these, they are different notions of what obligations are, which other actors in the world you owe obligations to. So then there is another question, of course, which is what do you owe people, whatever the community is. And here there are different perspectives again. So you can think about this from a classical liberal perspective, which is a perspective which today is manifested to some greater or lesser degree in libertarian accounts of how politics ought to work. And here typically the notion is that our obligations to other people are relatively limited. We do not have strong obligations to other people. More or less the obligation that we owe them is to leave them in peace. That is, not to try to kill them or to hurt them directly, not to try to take away their property. There is typically a strong emphasis on property rights. And what we should do is we should extend them what political philosophers such as Karl Popper have described as negative liberties. That is, liberties which are freedom from something, such as freedom from violence, freedom from theft. The liberties you owe to other people are these kinds of negative liberties, which are liberties to, in a certain sense, be left alone and not be bothered. If you think about this from a left liberal perspective instead, you will see a set of arguments which suggest that perhaps we owe other people something stronger than that. We might owe them some degree of material support. We might want to make sure that they had the basic material benefits that allowed them to live a reasonable life with some degree of human flourishing. What exactly that involves obviously differs from a liberal account to liberal account. Some people saying that if you owe people, perhaps you owe them some kind of a protection against falling into ill health. Or you owe them, some kind of a common schooling for their children, but not much more than that. Other people saying that you owe them some very extensive amount of material resources, which will allow them to flourish according to some broad definition of flourishing, typically with the idea being that you don't tell people how they ought to flourish, you just allow them to seek their own path to flourishing. So here, in a sense, classical liberals and left liberals, what they agree about is that people deserve a high degree of autonomy. They agree that that people should in a sense, be able to pursue their own goals and objectives. But classical liberals or libertarians tend to believe that effectively the best way to do this is just to have an obligation to leave people alone, whereas left liberals suggest that you want to give them active material support, perhaps to flourish according to their own lights. There are religious perspectives as well, and what can be said, and here this is a very crude generalization which does not apply to every situation by any means, but roughly speaking, religious perspectives typically do have a strong emphasis, and here they disagree with, for example, classical liberal or libertarian perspectives. They do have a strong emphasis on material support. You owe alms to other people in the Christian tradition, in Judaism, there is a sense that you owe, so if you owe to the poorer members of your society, you effectively you have substantial obligations to support them, and so on. In Islam, there is a very similar set of notions around the need for charity, and the same can be said of pretty well any major religion in the world. So all of the major world religions have a strong emphasis on providing support for the needy. This is something that is key and that is crucial. Typically, however, in contrast to left liberal perspectives, you do not support other people to flourish according to their own lights. There typically is some specific understanding of what flourishing involves, which means that whatever material support you provide people with may come with some degree of conditions. It may be that you have some idea given by your religion of what the good life ought to be, and so you support people to live that good life, and you don't have any particular obligation to support them to live in ways which flagrantly flout your own religious values. So here, in a sense, you can think about religious perspectives as having a quite different sense of what your obligations are than either the classical liberal or the left liberal perspectives. We'll talk a little bit about this in the course of the class as we continue, but the emphasis will probably be, it will be more on the classical liberal and left liberal perspectives because the religious approach to these has not been the dominant approach at the level of international politics and the nation. Now, there is also a set of other specific questions that you might want to think about with regard to international politics, because international politics, as opposed to domestic politics, is a realm where there is going to be a lot of value clash. So if you think, for example, about China, if you think about the United States, if you think about Italy, if you think about Burma, you see all of these are different societies which have different cultures and which organize themselves to some greater or lesser degree around different values. Obviously, there is some degree of shared values across the world, but there is also, and this is a point that Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu have made in a very good book, there is also a lot of value clash and value disagreement, which goes together with the organization of the international system into a series of states, each of which has its own particular approach to things. So we can think about how it is also that the nation state also has consequences for these value clashes and has consequences for how those value clashes get organized. Typically, the nation state the way that the nation state is organized is so that it has a high degree of autonomy within its own territorial jurisdiction to implement its own values, which plausibly should have some reference to the values of its citizens, but obviously that again varies from nation state to nation state. And this is one of the key principles of sovereignty. This goes back to the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Augsburg and the Treaty of Westphalia, which were pieces which came and treaties which came out of this war. And one of the basic principles that was decided, and this was a war over religion between Catholicism and Protestantism, was cuius regio, eius religio, which is in Latin a way of saying whoever is the ruler, his is the religion or hers is the religion that dominates in that particular country. So in other words, that states have the right to set their own values to decide upon which appropriate set of values operates within their own national territory. And the other implication of this, which goes together with this, is that the nation state is associated with citizenship. Citizenship used not to be nearly so much of a big deal in the world as it is now. There were societies such as the Greek city-states or Rome, where citizenship had important consequences, but very often citizenship, especially if you were at the menial side of society, if you were a serf or whatever, really didn't mean all that much to your everyday life. Now citizenship has a lot of meaning, because what it means in a world where we have nation states is that, first of all, the nation state is likely to treat its citizens in a different way than non-citizens. That is something that is implied within the nation state as a unit. And secondly, the nation state, sort of as a result of that, the nation state effectively suggests that so if we are in a world that is organized around nation states, that this is a world in which we have fellow nationals who are treated in one way, who perhaps have a stronger set of rights and obligations in practice, and foreigners who typically have weaker rights and weaker obligations within most national territories. So, and finally, we live in a world which is anarchic. We live in a world where there is no overall authority that is set over states. And so this means that we do not have any universal approach to values. We don't have any kind of one size fits all, or any kind of universal giver of values across the world. And this also means that there's a sharp likelihood of conflict over the values that apply under different situations. So here again we have different approaches that are identified to some degree with the different schools that we have looked at over the last several weeks. So if you look at realists are the people who are most comfortable with the notion that we are in a world of different states, with different values, and with different, with the right to apply those values within their own national and sovereign territories. And realists tend to be pretty okay with this. And there is a classic realistic argument which says effectively that when we have clashes of values between different states, they're probably not going to get resolved in any direct way. The only way in which they might get resolved is through coercion or force or whatever, but that tends to be pretty expensive and difficult. And most realists think that it is a really bad idea to go to war in pursuit of your values. They think that this is kind of a distraction from the survival, which is what you ought to be emphasizing. And so we have, in a sense, this classical notion of realism, which goes back to scholars such as Max Weber, which you can see in various people, again, who I have not assigned because there's only so much reading you can do, like John Holtzman, like Jack Goldsmith. And these are people who more or less argue that we live in a world where value clash between different states in the international system is something that is fundamentally irresolvable. There is no way to resolve these value clashes. We live in a world where different states will have different values, and that is just something that you have to live with. Liberals tend to be more optimistic. They believe that there is a universal set of beliefs and values which are better than other beliefs and values, and this of course is liberalism itself. They believe that liberalism provides a framework within which people from different perspectives and with different notions of flourishing can get along pretty happily and pretty easily. And so they tend to be very often, or at least they have tended to be until the last couple of years, cautiously optimistic that over time liberalism is going to win in the world, that everybody is going to realize that the liberal system is the best system, and that we will end up in a convergence on some form of global liberalism. As Thomas Friedman of the New York Times put it in a book a number of years ago, he suggested that that states had a choice, a fundamental choice, that they could either choose for liberalism, and in particular for free market liberalism, that they could choose free markets, or they could choose North Korea. In other words, that your only choice was to either converge upon global liberalism and market liberalism, or else to become a hermit state that was treated as an outcast by the rest of the international system. You have similar arguments being made very often by liberals who are more interested in human rights, suggesting that over time there is a convergence upon human rights across different states. But of course, both of these arguments have received significant setbacks in the recent past. And finally, we have constructivists, and constructivists tend to focus on international norms and conventions. And here, effectively, what they do is, rather than assuming, as liberals tend to do, that everybody is going to converge upon a common set of norms and conventions, they tend instead to say, well, we don't see any fundamental and final resolution of values within value clashes within these kinds of norms and conventions. Instead, what we see is that we see structured processes of argument around these norms in kind of the same way as you get in a court system in a country such as the United States, where different lawyers argue that different principles ought to be interpreted in different ways. So this is not like a complete free-for-all. It is a structured process, but it is a process that never reaches any final end point or solution. So constructivists tend to be a little bit, and I stress the word tend, they tend to be a little less confident than liberals in believing that we are all necessarily going to converge upon a common normative understanding of the world. They think that argument and interpretation is something that is perpetually ongoing and can never fully be avoided. So that is pretty well all that I have to say for you for the moment, about how ethics works in international relations. Now I'm going to jump completely to talk about international migration and the international migration regime. And then after we have talked about that for a while, we can then return to the question of how to bring together the specific situation of international migration with the kinds of ethical questions that we have talked about to date. First of all, some facts about international migration. These facts are relatively recent, but may have been affected in many ways by the coronavirus. We will talk about coronavirus right at the end of the class. Roughly speaking, there are approximately 240 odd million migrants in the world. That is people who have moved across the borders from one country to another. So that is not a majority of the world population or anything like it. It's only 3% of the world population, but nonetheless it's a pretty significant number. Of those migrants, 8% are, very roughly speaking, somewhere around 10 million people are refugees. That is, they are people who qualify under the definition of a refugee, who are fleeing some kind of a direct persecution that would put them in severe danger if they stayed where they had originated from. Now, of the other migrants, many other migrants are people who are looking for they are looking for safety too. They may not qualify under the narrow definition of a refugee, but they may be fleeing some humanitarian catastrophe, or they may also be fleeing some economic catastrophe, some situation where they simply do not have the capability, given the economy of their home country, to make a living, to get food for their family, to support themselves in even the most minimal way. And other people, again, are simply looking for economic opportunity elsewhere. They believe that they could do better finding opportunities in other countries than in their home country. So those are the figures, and there are some very rough general findings which social scientists have about the consequences that migrants have for the places that they end up in. And these general findings, regardless of what your ethical or normative approach to migrants is, are pretty straightforward. First of all, there are a wide variety of studies which suggest that migrants, including undocumented migrants who go to advanced industrialized countries such as the United States, that they tend to provide economic benefits. That is that on net, if you look at the contributions to the economy and so on, that countries like the United States, if all you care about is the economy, that these migrants provide more benefits significantly than they take away. We don't have similar results looking at what happens when migrants go to less economically well-developed countries, but we do know this sort of about when they go to advanced industrialized democracies such as the United States. And we also know that when they go to countries such as the United States, they tend to be less likely to commit violent crimes or other crimes than citizens of the countries that they go to. They tend, in a sense, sort of to on a variety of measures of criminality, to be less willing to commit serious crimes or significant crimes than are the natural-born citizens of the countries that they go to. So they have to, however, contend with a international migration regime which is not set up to be particularly migrant-friendly. This is something where I am borrowing a lot from the work of Alex Betts. Again, he is somebody who has not been assigned for this week. There are a lot of readings that I've used and people who I'm effectively drawing upon here in order to present this lecture. And Betts provides a very useful short analysis of the international migration regime and where it has come from. So it used to be that there used to be relatively limited restrictions on migration. It used to be much, much more easy to move around the world than it is at the moment. And in part this was because if you moved from one country to another, you did not assume very much in the way of rights in the new country that you moved to, except the right perhaps to seek employment and other things like that. But as we see the welfare state emerging, the welfare state tends to be linked to citizenship of one sort or another. Welfare is provided for fellow citizens and not for others. And so this then leads to a much stricter migration regime than in the past. And this eventually gets to some degree formalized internationally under the League of Nations, which creates a basic passport regime, a regime under which individuals, if they wanted to travel from one country to another, needed to have a passport to show that, issued by their home country, and this passport needed to have a permission from the country that they were visiting. In other words, it needed to have a visa of one sort or another. So this emerges all in the early 20th century, along with a set of formalizations of the border controls that have already begun to come into existence. So that's the first major step that you see, is the creation of an international regime which regulates migration and which limits people's rights and ability to travel from one country to another. Then we see after World War II, we see a variety of problems emerging because of wartime displacement and Cold War politics. So that, for example, we see a whole bunch of Germans being kicked out of countries such as Czechoslovakia, as it was then, for the reason that Germans in the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia, had been part of the reason why Adolf Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia in the first place, and they were perceived as not being loyal to the state that they lived in, so they found themselves effectively having to return to Germany. We saw other major displacements across the world, including, of course, the displacement, the displacement of Jewish people who had managed to survive the Holocaust and the associated horrors, and who began to flood many of them to the United States, many of them to try to set up the state of Israel. So this then leads to a whole lot of problems and complicated politics that need to be resolved. It becomes clear to countries that they need to figure out some way to try and regularize the massive flows of people from one country to another. And of course, in addition to these more political flows, we have a lot of people who are wandering around Europe, starving to death, looking for food, looking for some kind of opportunity to live. There is a grim winter after the war, and the economies of most of mainland Europe have been shattered by the war. So there are a lot of people who are just simply wandering, looking for some kind of opportunity to live. So this then leads to the UNRWA, which is created in 1949 in order to provide a space for, in order to regulate Palestinian refugees. This is the time at which Israel is being set up, and a lot of Palestinians are suddenly displaced. They find themselves being expelled from villages and elsewhere, and so the United Nations sets up a agency which is supposed to look after them. We also see the UNHCR, which is established a year later, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the High Commissioner for Refugees, which is established in 1950 to deal with similar problems happening in Europe and to provide some kind of a means of regulating these flows of people. In 1951, a convention on the status of refugees is established, initially with application to Europe, and it is widened to the rest of the world in 1967. And finally, we see the establishment of the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which is first of all established as a temporary committee in 1951, but then becomes more and more regularized as a source of policy, as a source of information, and as the international institution which is charged with thinking generally about migration-related issues. So after the Cold War, there is a big expansion in the role and resources of both the International Organization for Migration and the UNHCR. These are both perceived as being key organizations. There is an interest in trying to solve migration issues. There is also the disappearance of the major political divisions that there have been between the West and the East, creates a set of opportunities as people who are looking to try and build out a more substantial regime for migrants with stronger obligation towards various groups of migrants. They perceive this as being a moment when they can do this. So they start to push for a more general legal framework with much stronger international obligations for migration issues. They establish a variety of new groups and dialogues which are all aimed at talking about the problem, at finding solutions to the problems of migration, to the problems of refugees. And so, there's hope that the international regime for refugees can be reformed to make it easier for refugees to find permanent and reasonable places. And the International Organization for Migration is integrated into the United Nations. So this then pushes for a major declaration, which is supposed to be made in New York in 2016, the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, and they have high hopes. They believe that this is the moment, this is a high water mark at which they can establish a set of rules that will make it possible to deal with much greater flows of people in the future, because they're worried that we're going to see more migration, more involuntary migration happening, for example, because of global warming. And there also are a variety of humanitarian crises, wars that are happening that mean that people want to do something about this. So this declaration is supposed to provide stronger obligations for migration. It's supposed to provide general protections for the human rights of refugees and migrants that have very often not been particularly adhered to. It's supposed to stop children from being detained in order to determine whether they are allowed to be migrants or not. It's supposed to give children an opportunity effectively to avoid detention, and it's supposed to provide general support for the states that are receiving refugees, because there is a lot of disparity in the international community between some states which have large numbers of migrants and refugees. Very often these are states which are, relatively speaking, poorer. Sometimes they are more politically unstable, and states, very often rich states with the resources to pour into borders, who do not have nearly so many refugees. And so the idea is that the regime ought to provide much more support for the states that are receiving the refugees than it has in the past. None of this works. So the New York Declaration arrives at a time when the migration regime is in crisis, and when people are able to see, so states are able to see the costs of migration, and no state wants to face up to increased costs and increased obligation for migrants, even though they recognize that the human situation of many migrants and refugees is pretty grim. So we see the New York Declaration, it fails to share responsibilities as it was supposed to. It fails to provide a framework that addresses migrants more generally, that is including economic migrants and other people who don't fall under the strict definition of refugees. It doesn't provide this kind of framework, and it also it fails to provide any enforcement mechanisms that would act against governments that fail to live up to their obligations to refugees. And this is in part because of continued pressures. There is a civil war happening in Syria, which means that European countries are particularly inclined to be ungenerous. We will talk about that a little bit later. The United States and other countries don't particularly want to put huge amounts of resources into this. And so we see effectively a world in which the international migration regime had a moment when people tried to make it stronger in order to deal with the increased likelihood of civil wars, the likelihood of continued economic flows of people from one country to another, and the likely future challenge of global warming. And for a variety of political reasons, they countries decided not to expand these obligations. And indeed, in many ways, we have seen over the last few years, the states have become increasingly willing to ignore the commitments that they signed up to on migration as they face increased flows of potential migrants across their borders. How does this work in the United States? The United States is a country of immigrants. Immigrants make up approximately 14% of the population, according to the last census. And if you include in the children of immigrants, people whose parents immigrated over here, that is approximately 27% of the population. And of course, I speak as somebody who is an immigrant myself. That said, the rate of immigration has slowed significantly over the last decade. There are less people immigrating than there used to be, and over, of course, the Trump administration, and we will talk about this. The Trump administration has done everything it can in order to stop immigration of one sort or another. Under the existing United States migration regime, there are a variety of statuses that people can have which allow them to stay in the country as more than just tourists or business people. So migrants can get, if they are lucky, they can get green cards. And the green cards are effectively permanent residency. They allow people to become permanent residents of the United States, either because of marriage, because they are married to a US citizen, or perhaps because they are a relative of a US citizen, but that is much harder to get, or because they are able to get this through work. There is something that they do that is that effectively allows them a path to permanent residency. Certain kinds of positions, certain kinds of jobs can do this. It's also possible for people to hold any of a variety of temporary visas. So-called H-1B visas are one of the more common visas for people with certain kinds of high skills. There are other visas that provide people with the opportunity to stay for some period, not indefinitely, and to work while they are staying. And sometimes it is possible to move from one of these temporary visas into a category that can allow you to apply for a green card. It's possible, although the Trump administration has tried to push back on this, to apply for admission as a refugee, to state conditions that show that you're a refugee, and hence to apply for permission to come in. Under the DACA, immigrants who arrived as children have a status which allows them to stay and to have their stays renewed. Although again, the Trump administration has sought to push back against this. There has been a proposal which has been bruited around in various places for the so-called DREAM Act, which would be a means for people under DACA to stay permanently, to have permanent status. If you arrived into the United States as a kid, whether you're a undocumented migrant or not, you'll be able to stay. And finally, there is a semi-arbitrary mixture of tolerance and enforcement for a wide variety of undocumented migrants. If you, for example, go to California, approximately half of farm laborers in California are undocumented migrants, and they sometimes have to suffer from raids from ICE and from other bodies, but very often, because the economy effectively relies upon them, they have some degree of wiggle room to stay and to continue, albeit with the perpetual threat that they might be deported, and with certain kinds of harassment, and with a lack of legal rights that goes together with this, so that, for example, if they get too agitated against their employer can simply threaten to notify them to the immigration authorities and get them deported, so that they very often have to endure miserable work conditions and miserable pay as a result. Now, of course, under Trump, we have seen a very, very sharp effort to reduce migration to the United States. This includes the wall, which is being built in bits and pieces. It includes efforts which have been made to remove undocumented immigrants on a expedited basis, to make it much, much harder for undocumented immigrants to appeal against their removal. It includes the empowerment of ICE, the enforcement part of the of the immigration authorities to mount raids and to otherwise make life difficult for undocumented migrants. We see efforts such as the deliberate and punitive separation of families, of children from parents as a policy measure in order to try and discourage people from migrating. And we see a variety of efforts to phase out DACA and to effectively deny any long-term legal status to people who entered the country as undocumented migrants while they were children. We've also seen a crackdown on refugees. There's been a huge cut in the number of refugees that the United States accepts, and we have seen there have been a variety of individuals from particular countries who have had what is called temporary protected status when they have fled various catastrophes in their home country. This includes Haitians, Nicaraguans, Hondurans, people from Nepal, people from Salvador. We've seen the ending of the status that allowed these people to stay. We have seen the famous travel ban on various countries, countries in the Islamic world. We have seen also the higher American quote-unquote cut back of H-1B visas, which are intended to allow highly skilled immigrants to come to the United States for a number of years. This is something which the Trump administration had viewed as being a threat to the American way of life and has sought to cut back on. So the result is that we have seen massive falls in, for example, the number of refugees. This is a graph from the Wall Street Journal, which gives you some sense of how the ceiling for refugees has fallen, and the ceiling for refugees has fallen yet again since that graph was made. Now, people think about Europe as being a more touchy-feely, human rights-centered political space, but in fact it turns out that the European approach to migrants is not particularly, it is not quite as harsh in some ways as the US approach, but is certainly extremely harsh in a variety of other ways, and is getting more harsh and more brutal over time. So on the one hand, the European Union, the major political body within Europe, of course, has a right to movement for EU citizens and permanent residents. So if you live in the European Union, if you live, for example, in Ireland, if you live in France, up until recently, if you lived in the United Kingdom, you have the right to move across the European Union in search of work. So this is one of the 4 freedoms, which are the basic freedoms that you're supposed to have within the European Union. And this is a pretty good deal. If you are Irish, and I have taken advantage of this during my own life in Europe, it's very easy to go to Italy and to, so you register yourself with the local authorities, with the tax authorities and whoever, and you can more or less begin working as soon as you want. You also have some social security rights, albeit more limited. This is something that has been expanded gradually over time by decisions taken by the European Court of Justice. But there have been some fears about, among countries which have generous social security, that generous social security, that people from other countries would flock to them to take advantage of the benefits. So you do not have the same rights to social security necessarily as do the citizens of the country in question. But nonetheless, you can move there, you can work, and you can more or less establish your status over time. So this right to movement within the European Union also means that the European Union has some need to coordinate its visa and border policy. If you are within the EU, you have to live up to certain broad requirements as to the kinds of circumstances under which you provide visas to people from other countries. You have to live up to certain kinds of obligations with regard to borders. And within the European Union, there is a more specific agreement, the Schengen Agreement, which covers EU member states, except for UK and Ireland and a couple of other places like Bulgaria. And this is a common visa agreement, which effectively has no permanent border controls. So Schengen countries such as France and Germany do not have permanent border controls, customs stops, so that you have to pass through on the roads in order to get from France to Germany. Although they sometimes mount spot checks on trains and whatever, and have random checking to make sure that criminals and others can't get through. And this, of course, has all become a lot more complicated as a result of coronavirus, which I will again talk about later in the lecture. Within the European Union, this has led to some political controversy. One of the reasons that the United Kingdom, for example, wanted to leave the European Union was because of a perception that economic migrants from places such as Poland were going to the United Kingdom and were taking up jobs and working more cheaply than UK subjects were prepared to work for. And this was perceived by many UK voters as being a problem, and was one of the reasons why they wanted to leave the European Union in the first place. And finally, there is a common system for dealing with asylum seekers, which is the so-called Dublin Convention. And the idea behind the Dublin Convention is that in principle, you are supposed to, if you're seeking asylum as a refugee in the European Union, you're supposed to seek asylum in the first country that you arrive in. That is, if you arrive in Greece or if you arrive in Italy, you are not supposed to be able to travel on to Germany and seek asylum there. Instead, you have to seek asylum in the country, Greece or Italy or wherever, that you first arrived in. And this, of course, creates some inequities between different European states, which has resulted in a variety of problems as the European refugee crisis has gotten going. So effectively what we saw over a number of years, this is slightly abated but only somewhat, is that the Syrian and Libyan civil wars led to a lot of people wanting to get out of those countries. So if you were in Syria, you were prepared to take a lot of risks to get your family to Europe because you faced the possibility of being killed in a devastating civil war in which both sides committed human rights atrocities if you did not. Same story within Libya. And also there are a variety of other countries in the Mediterranean regions which did not have the kinds of enormous civil war type crises that Syria and Libya did, but also had a lot of people who were looking to move for a variety of political and economic reasons. And Europe and the European Union was a destination of choice for many of these people. If they could have gotten to the United States, very likely they would have liked to have gotten there, but it's very hard to get from Syria or Libya to the United States, whereas Europe, the European Union, is much closer. It's across the Mediterranean from many of these countries. It is a pretty good place from the point of view of economic opportunities, and also a lot of people were attracted because there were existing communities of co-ethnics. If you were Syrian or if you were Libyan, and if you managed to get to one of these countries and managed to get into a situation where you could start looking for a job, you could find fellow citizens from your home country who could provide you as a community that spoke your language, that knew your customs, that had your food, and that could perhaps help you to get yourself organized and oriented and sorted out, in the assumption that once you became established and once you were able to participate fully in the economic life of the country you'd come to, that you would pass on the favor to other people who came in from your home country in the future. And so the result of all of these pull factors and push factors was a massive increase in the number of refugees and other migrants that started to try to get into Europe. And they primarily sought access via the Mediterranean, some of them trying to come over land, many of them trying to come over sea. And again, they came for a variety of humanitarian motives. Some of them were just refugees seeking to flee human rights atrocities and the likelihood of being killed. Some of them were coming from for economic reasons because they simply wanted a better life elsewhere. So this led to a lot of to many problems and to a pretty strong European counter-response. So we saw many people who died trying to migrate to Europe. Lots of people in boats in the Mediterranean. Many of these boats were not particularly seaworthy. Many people drowned. And we saw efforts by the European Union to turn back these boats, to force these boats to return to where they came from, even when the consequences, the humanitarian consequences of this were relatively dire. Within the European Union, we saw strong inequities between states. Some states bore by far the greater load of incoming refugees, in particular Italy and Greece. Italy and Greece were both relatively straightforward to get to from Africa and from Syria, and so they were the dominant countries of arrival. They were the countries that were easiest to get to. Both of these countries had long coastlines, had islands, had other places which were difficult for the local naval forces to monitor and to keep keep an eye on the coastlines, so that migrants who were trying to get to Europe had a higher chance of success by going for Italy or for Greece than certainly for going for countries which were further up north. But also Italy and Greece, neither of these had the kinds of financial resources which would have allowed them to have received refugees with any degree of ease, and they also had strong incentives, given politics and given a variety of other problems, to not treat these refugees particularly well. So they tended, when they got refugees or people who are applying for refugee status, they tended to house them in pretty miserable camps with very poor living conditions indeed, and a lot of forms of abuse that happened within the camps, and a lot of pretty horrible human rights stories. Eventually, there was a sharp decline in the numbers of people looking to migrate, but this, in part because the situation in Syria became slightly better than it had been. But during the period that this happened, this was a very serious problem, and we have still seen a continuation of the problem and a continuation of many of the pressures to date. This led to increasing xenophobia. In countries in Eastern Europe, most notably Hungary, where Orban, the president of Hungary, effectively organized around anti-migration as one of his key political platforms, suggesting that migrants they were aliens who were going to come in with a variety of non-European ways of thinking, that they were from different religions. There was a certain degree of racism in the appeals that Orban made, and also we saw the same thing happening in Italy and elsewhere. We saw parties such as the League, which originally the Lega Nord in Italy, rising to power. We saw the Sons of Italy, which is a quasi-fascist movement, which is descended from Mussolini's party, rising to political prominence in Italy, and all of these political actors using refugees, using immigration as being a key breach issue to push back against the establishment political parties. And finally, we saw a breakdown temporarily of the Dublin regime. So that when the crisis was at its height, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, effectively suggested that she would welcome refugees to Germany, regardless of whether they had arrived, regardless of whether they had come to Germany first or not. This proved to be politically impossible to keep up over the longer term, but nonetheless, it led to a degree of feeling that the Dublin regime, the Dublin Convention, this convention under which your country of first arrival was the key determinant, that this was something that was going to be difficult to maintain over the longer run. Okay, so those are the facts. So we have, first of all, we have talked about ethics, then we have talked about the facts of the international migration regime, and we have talked about the facts of migration politics as they exist today in the United States and Europe. Now we're going to try and put these together. And we're going to try and think about how do we think about migration from different ethical perspectives. And then once we have talked about that, we will then be able to talk more specifically about how we might think about the different things that are happening in Europe, in the United States, and in the world refugee, and world migration regime as well. So the first basic question that we need to ask in order to get to this is to go back to these questions about cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, and to think about what is the ethical status of the nation state. And here there's a standard answer that many political theorists give, and in particular this is exemplified by the work of John Rawls, who is perhaps the most famous liberal political theorist and philosopher of the last number of decades. And Rawls effectively suggested that we have strong obligations to other people, but only to those people who are fellow citizens of ours. So he effectively says, Rawls argues strongly against a cosmopolitan position. He argues for a nationalist position, a nationalist liberal position, and he says that what we need to do, that we have a strong obligation to behave justly, that we have a strong need for political justice within our societies, but only within our societies, that we look at our national society and we treat it as a closed system. And then Rawls suggests his famous idea, and here I'm only giving a very, very crude account of this. Again, apologies. If you want to study political theory or political philosophy, you'll get a much better, much more sophisticated account. Rawls says that within any country, the best way in which we can think about justice is by thinking about what we might call the veil of ignorance. And so under the veil of ignorance, we would imagine, what if we did not know what status we had in society, whether we were rich, whether we were poor, whether we were male, whether we were female, whether we were transsexual, whether we were, whether we were, all of these different kinds of identities that one might have. Also economic questions, so whether we were rich, whether we were poor, all of these questions. So the idea that Rawls had is, let's imagine that we do not know, that we are behind a veil of ignorance. We do not know which of these various different identities, these various different positions in society we occupy, and we have no idea of this. How would we then want to arrange things? If we did not know if we were going to be rich or if we were going to be poor, if we did not know whether we were male or female, whether we were white or black, how would we want to arrange society? And so Rawls says that this is the fundamental way in which we might want to think about justice, that if we can abstract away from those various different aspects of who we are, if we can think about this as somebody who simply does not know how, what particular aspects we have, what kind of society would we want to live in, And the implication of this is that if we don't know these things, then we are going to effectively choose a society in which we effectively we maximize we maximize the benefits and the happiness to different people in a reasonable and in a just way. And this is, of course, a position that has gotten a lot of argument and a lot of pushback from people who, for example, argue that you simply, by abstracting away these things, you are throwing away many of the aspects of human life that are in fact important. But it is a theory of justice that has turned out to be a very, very persuasive theory for many people. Because what it suggests then is that you might want, for example, to make sure, if you did not know whether you're going to be rich or whether you're going to be poor, whether you're going to be advantaged or whether you're going to be disadvantaged, you might want to have social arrangements which were for the benefit of the least advantaged people in society. You might want to pay particular deference to the least advantaged people because, effectively you would think to yourself, well, I don't know whether I'm going to be rich or whether I'm going to be poor, but if I am going to be poor and completely disadvantaged, I want to have at least some life chances to do things well. But at the same time, you would not want to have a complete egalitarian system according to Rawls. You wouldn't want to have a situation in which there was no rich and there were no poor, because there are benefits that everybody gets from having a system in which some people can make more money than other people through effort and through entrepreneurialism and through risk taking and all of these things. And so therefore you would end up in a society, a national society, where you would pay special attention to making sure that the least advantaged in society had the benefits that they needed to have in order to live reasonable lives, while at the same time not wanting to impose equality over everything else. So this is a nationalist account. This is an account of justice which is based within the nation state, where effectively we have this veil of ignorance which would allow us to then figure out what is the just way to arrange the internal politics of the nation state, but with a strong implication being that the obligation, if you're if you're a classic liberal or libertarian, you would have a very different take on this. You might think, for example, that our obligations to others are relatively minimal and based in natural rights. And this is something that Robert Nozick, who was a famous libertarian philosopher, said, is that we have a limited number of natural rights. We have a right to acquire and to use property, and we have a right to engage in voluntary exchanges with others, and nobody has any rights to interfere either in our property or in our voluntary exchanges with others. And so this then suggests that we want to have a arrangement which might be called a night watchman state. That is a state which does no more than to stop people from interfering in other people's property or in other people's voluntary exchanges. And this account would suggest that there is no particular reason why we might want to distinguish between fellow nationals and other people under most circumstances. There is no general rationale for restricting immigration or migration. That the state under the libertarian account would suggest that, the libertarian account would suggest that the state should not prohibit free movement, because by prohibiting free movement across borders, you're limiting peaceful exchange, you're limiting peaceful and voluntary exchanges between people, and hence you are interfering with their natural rights. You might be able to make a limited case for more security-based restrictions if there are genuine risks to life or to property that come from movement across borders. Say, for example, there is a crowd of Vikings and Viking longships who are going to come and invade you and pillage your country if you do not restrict them from doing that. Then that kind of restriction is okay under a libertarian perspective, because that is protecting natural rights. But in general, you don't want to interfere with people's rights to movement unless this has more general negative consequences for their natural rights. And you can think about this as in some ways reflecting the more open immigration policies of the 19th century, although you also would want to observe that in the 19th century you saw a lot of racial restrictions, of course, on migration, and you saw a lot of tensions associated with that. So then, however, we have talked about a nationalist liberal approach and we have talked about a libertarian approach. but there is also a cosmopolitan approach, and this is exemplified in the readings by the Joe Cairns reading. So what Cairns does is he says, well, if you look at the left, liberal nationalist perspective that Rawls has, well, what Rawls is doing in effect is he is saying that he's loading the dice by saying that we only have obligations to our fellow nationals. And then he says, imagine if we thought about the veil of ignorance at the level of the world. That is, that in addition to not knowing whether you're black or white, male or female, rich or poor, all of these other things, you did not know what your nationality was. What kind of a world would you want to live in if we did not know what nationality was? And Cairns' point here is that nationality is associated with a variety of benefits. If you are a citizen, for example, of the United States, you have many benefits, including, for example, under at least the typical circumstances we've had in the last few months, the ability to travel very freely across many parts of the world. If you are coming from a country such as Egypt, you might find it much harder to travel to many parts of the world, and you might have a lot of other restrictions on you. If you are in the United States, you are likely to have a variety of political and economic freedoms as a citizen of the United States that you obviously are not going to enjoy as a citizen of North Korea. So Cairns says, in effect, that which nationality you have has huge consequences for your life chances, and therefore maybe we should think, when we're thinking about the veil of ignorance, we should not restrict it to our fellow nationals. We should instead think about, if we have a veil of ignorance on the worldwide level, how would we want to choose to organize world politics? How would we want to choose to organize world politics as such that there was some degree of justice between different people from different nation states, as well as rather than just limiting this as Rawls does to within the nation state. And so Cairns suggests that under these circumstances we might choose a global regime in which there are nation states. There are some reasons why you might want to have nation states, because the value pluralism, the fact that different nation states have different values, the fact that different nation states have different ethnic identities, these might be viewed under some circumstances as being good things. You might want to live in a state together with other fellow nationals or other members of a particular ethnic group if you fear that otherwise you might be discriminated against. But you would also want in this world, according to the principles of justice, you would want to have relatively free movement of people among states, because otherwise you will be limiting people's ability to flourish according to their own lights, to pursue economic opportunity, to pursue love with people who live in different countries, to pursue better economic, not only economic conditions, but political conditions, or better conditions for their own beliefs by going to a country in which their religion is not persecuted. All of these things, Cairns says, are things that would justify us in saying that the just way to organize the world would involve a high degree of free movement of people among states, and a very limited case for restrictions. You would perhaps want to prevent truly overwhelming forms of immigration in order to maintain public order, if you fear that the state was going to break down if you had too many immigrants rushing in. But whatever restrictions you had would have to apply in such a way as to not discriminate against those who are the truly worst off, and indeed the opposite. So if you think about the veil of ignorance, you might want to think about a world in which, if you were one of the truly worst off people in the world, you would want, and if this was a world that had some restrictions on immigration, you would want these restrictions on immigration not to discriminate against those who are truly worst off, because those who are truly worst off in the world are those who can benefit the most from moving from one country to another. So you would want whatever restrictions there were not to discriminate against those who are worst off, but instead to discriminate in favor of those who are worst off and to give them priority as immigrants. This would, of course, mean that you would give priority to refugees, but also to a wide variety of other people who don't have refugee status, and you would have no reason for granting specific preferences for co-ethnics. For fellow nationals, that's not something that you would want to do if you were imposing restrictions. So these are different approaches, different philosophical approaches to and different ethical approaches to how you might think about migration. So you have the libertarian approach, which effectively says that there should be free migration because you owe all you owe to other people is the right to respect their freedom to engage in voluntary exchange, and hence you shouldn't limit this unless there are strong reasons to do so. You have the left liberal cosmopolitan critique, which also supports open borders, but with the important difference that it emphasizes the benefits of the worst off, and it also suggests that you owe strong positive obligations to other people, that you don't just owe these negative obligations of respecting their right to property and their right to engage freely with each other in voluntary exchange. So those are two arguments from very, very different philosophical perspectives as to why it might be ethical to allow for freer movement across borders, for freer migration than we have at the moment. There also, of course, are people who argue against this. And here you might think about the nationalist defense against these arguments as going something like the following. So people who are nationalists might say we owe, rather than being cosmopolitans like Karens, or rather than just saying that we don't owe strong obligations to anybody, which is what libertarians like Nozick would suggest, they would suggest we do owe particular obligations to some people, but we owe those particular obligations to fellow nationals rather than to people in the world as a whole, or rather than to the poor and to the hungry of the world. We owe particular obligations to those who share our nationality. And this suggests, of course, that there's a strong relationship between nationalism and the state, that nations deserve states to protect them, and that you ought to use the tools of the state in order to protect and to help your fellow nationals. And here there are a number of other implications. If you're a nationalist, you probably believe that you want to preserve the things that make your nation unique, which means that you might want to preserve your common culture, your shared culture, the shared culture of the country that you live in, and this is necessary to maintaining a community that you view as being a valuable community. So you tend to you want to protect the common culture, and you want to, and this again suggests that you may want to be more skeptical about forms of immigration which might perhaps in your view undermine that common culture. And there are two different ways in which you might play this out. One might be a strong nationalist approach. The strong nationalist might say that protecting common culture is paramount, and that we should only permit immigration when it is really to the advantage of our fellow citizens, when there is some very, very strong reason for believing that it is going to benefit the nation as a whole. And this is a pretty tough bar to pass because the way that nationalists think is that much immigration could weaken the community and could weaken the nation rather than strengthening it. So what this suggests is that if you're a strong nationalist, you're not going to be particularly inclined to want to have refugees come in. You're going to feel that you owe little or no obligations to them. And instead, if you want anybody to come in, it's going to be co-nationals who are located abroad. So it might be, for example, if you're Viktor Orban, you want to have Hungarians who live in Romania or who live in other countries. You want to have these co-nationals. These co-nationals should have special privileges, should be able to come home if they want to, but other people you don't necessarily want to come in. Alternatively, you might think about nationalists as perhaps having a more moderate approach, and they might recognize that nationalism is important, but that there is some requirement to admit truly needy strangers for justice, but also these people need to be required to conform to the common culture of the country, and people who are not likely to conform to the common culture should be effectively discouraged from coming in. And so the idea here is again that you have a right as a nation to collectively self-determine your fate as a nation, and that you do not bring in people who undermine that right. And if you do bring in people, you bring in these people on the condition that they quickly adopt the common culture, that they quickly become part of the nation that they are now located in. So this goes together obviously with different approaches to economic migration and to how we ought to think about economic migrants. Libertarians, by and large, they are going to be in favor of economic migration and pursuit of opportunity. This goes together with their voluntaristic approach to what rights are, that people ought to be able to engage in free exchange. But it also goes hand in hand with the assumption that there are no strong obligations that you owe to economic migrants or indeed to anybody. So that the idea is that you have a minimal state which does nothing more than to protect people's property and people's right to engage in free exchange with each other. And certainly there is no strong assumptions under a libertarian approach that you owe welfare or money or economic or financial resources to the people who come into the country. Instead, if they work and contribute to the economy and are able to support themselves, that's great. If they end up starving, that is their problem and that is not your problem. Left liberal approach, instead, the Cairns approach, is in favor of economic migration so long as minimal public order requirements are met, but also suggests that this economic migration should go together with a significant degree of common solidarity towards the people who are coming in, that you want to provide them with some solidarity up to the point that this is what supports the notion of justice that you have. And as against these two approaches, both of which are roughly in favor of common economic migration, you have the strong nationalist approach, which is generally skeptical of economic migration. It doesn't see people coming in, even if they provide significant benefits to the economy. It is distrustful of them for the reason that it believes that they may undermine the sense of nationhood, and instead it emphasizes the interests of existing groups within society and the cohesion of the existing nation state. And then you have moderate nationalists who are in favor of economic migration only under quite specific conditions, when it does not challenge collective self-determination. In other words, when it involves people who are coming in for economic reasons but who are willing to conform to the norms of the new nation state, and where it clearly benefits existing citizens. And if you look at US history, a lot of US policy towards migration over significant periods of time has been a moderate nationalist approach, albeit with certain kinds of ethnic and racial discrimination attached to it. This has been the ideal that has often been expressed is the melting pot, that you have all of these people who come in. They may be Slovakian, they may be Irish, they may be from a variety of different parts of the world, but when they come in over a period of years, they will become American and their children will be fully American and they will be integrated into the culture of the country that they have joined. So the melting pot suggests that all of their pre-existing differences are going to melt away as they then become more American. So that is a standard moderate nationalist account of how this would work. They also have very different approaches to refugees. Libertarians, again, libertarians don't have any specific opposition to letting refugees in because they don't have any reason under their understanding of natural law why it is that anybody should be stopped from moving in pursuit of voluntary exchange. So libertarians have a laissez-faire attitude to refugees by and large. Of course, this varies from libertarian to libertarian. There are sort of differences within the community of libertarians insofar as you can describe them as being a community. That might be a definition that they might themselves disagree with. Left liberals, in contrast, left liberal cosmopolitans like Cairns, They aren't in a laissez-faire world. They instead have this strong presumption in favor of refugees, in favor of those who are the most endangered, the most likely to suffer if they cannot move, and the most likely to benefit if they can move. The left liberal cosmopolitans tend to have a strong presumption in favor of refugees and other people who are in dire need, and believe that these should be at the front of the queue. Strong nationalists have a general presumption against refugees who are not members of the existing national community, but it's plausible that they're going to have a welcome for fellow nationals who are coming from abroad and who are persecuted in their home countries. This is something that they view as being a good thing. And to the extent that nationalism and religious identity sometimes go together, they perhaps also have a welcome for co-religionists as people who are possibly going to be easier to assimilate within the nationalist project that they are committed to. Moderate nationalists are prepared to have a limited acceptance of refugees in real danger as long as the refugees are willing fully to embrace the new community that they have joined themselves to. How does this help us to understand the different political crises and questions that we have looked at? Well, if we look at the European crisis, we'll see that there are very, very few cosmopolitans in European politics. Certainly, very few European leaders who could be described as being cosmopolitans. Some activists qualify. A few politicians from parties like the Green Party qualify, but they are the exception rather than the rule. And we also see that the libertarian approach helps to explain how migration happens within Europe, but not migration to Europe. As you may remember, the European Union has this notion of the four freedoms that I described earlier in the lecture, under which one of these freedoms is the right to move without necessarily the right to welfare rights when you move from one country to another. You can move in search of employment, but you aren't necessarily going to be able to benefit from social welfare. And this is kind of, so this is close to a libertarian understanding of how migration ought to work. That you ought to be able to move in search of opportunity and voluntary exchange, but you ought not expect much in the way of substantial rights for material benefits from other people when you do move. Now, the limits of libertarianism have become clear as a result of Brexit, which, as I say, was in part provoked by this sort of policy framework, which the British government used to favour very strongly back in the 1990s, but which it became disenchanted with in the 2000s and the 2010s, as it became clear that many conservative and in particular working class conservatives in the United Kingdom were strongly opposed to it. So libertarianism of this sort can have can be hard to maintain especially in countries which feel where there are significant members of the population who feel that they are being disadvantaged by immigrants who come in and who are prepared to work more cheaply perhaps than they are. When we look at Europe, we can see that the major dispute over refugees and other migrants from Syria over the last number of years has really been a dispute between moderate and strong nationalists. Moderate nationals such as Angela Merkel, such as many of the Western members of the European Union, the countries in the western seaboard of the European Union, the Northwest in particular, they have worried about migration, and the key question they have asked is who should pay, how to deal with this. They want to limit flows, but they accept some rights, or they have accepted until recently some rights to refuge. Whereas strong nationalists such as Orban, such as politicians in Italy in particular, instead they want to keep the nation free from foreign influence. They see these migrants as being threats to national cohesion, and they don't want to accept any refugees at all, let alone economic migrants from outside the European Union, and have been prepared to be extremely strong and strident about this. So this helps us also to explain the European debate. So we saw how the European debate ended up with an effective stalemate in the European Union between the moderate nationalists and the strong nationalists. when Angela Merkel went for a moderate nationalist type initiative to welcome some refugees and try to share the burden around European Union countries. This was extremely unpopular with fellow conservatives, including fellow conservatives within Germany, and it didn't really work out. So that the deal which the European Union effectively made was to outsource the problem. It went to other countries to build so-called disembarkation platforms in Mediterranean countries bordering the European Union but not members of the European Union, where it effectively bribed them in a variety of ways to keep refugees within their countries and economic migrants and not to allow them to travel onto Europe. This was most notable in a deal with Turkey, under which Turkey was supposed to get large amounts of money in exchange for closing the land border to Europe. It now looks like that deal is under some pressure. Turkey is saying that Europe has reneged on its part of the deal, and Turkey has been allowing migrants to start crossing the border into Greece, with the result that European Union has been firing shots and doing other things in order to prevent refugees from coming through. There have also been riots in various in Greek islands and other places where various nationalist groups have sought to attack refugees and sought to attack doctors and other people who are working with refugees. So what we see now is we see an uneasy stalemate where there is a tacit acceptance within European countries of existing refugee populations, no desire to have any more. Some countries are moving closer towards the xenophobic right, and there is no real policy solutions that are visible. And we see how the approach that the European Union has made of effectively seeking to outsource the problem to other bordering countries that border with the European Union, that this may not be maintainable over the longer term. So we are likely to see more trouble developing. In the United States, we see, of course, that the Trump administration is very clearly, it can be understood as being a strong nationalist administration with regard to its attitude to migration. And the Camerota argument gives you, the Camerota readings, gives you some sense of how these arguments are made. So it effectively says, so that we can't have so many people coming in because they cannot be absorbed by US institutions and culture. There is a strong focus on the interests of working class voters, which are presumed to be white working class voters who are supposed to be opposed to immigration. And we have seen within the Republican Party, we've seen for the moment a tacit victory of strong nationalists over libertarians. If you think about the Republican Party as having been dominated by a kind of tacit coalition between people who are ideologically strongly conservative on cultural grounds and business interests who very often are more liberal on a variety of grounds when it comes to things like sexual identity or other questions, including migration. Typically up until the Trump administration, the business side of that coalition won out, with the result that there was a lot of effective toleration of illegal illegal employment by big employers of workers who are undocumented, because this was cheap for the this was a cheap source of labor, and conservative worries about these people were very often consigned to the back burner. Now we see that the relationship has reversed, so that until the coronavirus crisis at least, businesses still wanted a lot of immigration into the country and found themselves effectively being frustrated by the desire of the Trump administration instead to cater to a strong nationalist approach, which had a lot of appeal to some highly culturally conservative members of the Republican voting base. Of course, we see how it is that others have set themselves up against us. So we see that there's been a tacit alliance between moderate nationalists and cosmopolitan left liberals against the Trump administration's approach to this. And they share a number of common beliefs about the economic benefits of immigration and some degree of concern about human rights of immigrants who are trapped in the detention system. But we could also see how under different political circumstances, the cracks in this coalition might begin to appear. That if, for example, we moved to a situation where it was possible to have further legislation that might make it easier for immigrants to come in, that moderate nationalists might begin to become more nervous about this, that they prefer an approach which is based on the melting pot, as opposed to the approach that many cosmopolitan left liberals have, which is about the celebration of differences of identity, celebration of diversity, all of these things which many moderate nationalists are suspicious of or nervous about, so that you can imagine that that implicit coalition, which is relatively strong in the era of the Trump administration, might be weaker if a different administration came in that started to advance positive policy proposals, which might move either towards the melting pot or towards the more celebration of diversity, giving one coalition partner the sense that it was winning and the other coalition partner the sense that it was losing. All of this is changing in ways that are really hard to figure out, so I'm just giving you a very quick analysis which I've taken from an article by an author called Piccoli for the Monkey Cage blog that I helped run for the Washington Post. So he argues here that coronavirus is going to pose enormous challenges that we're only beginning to understand to movement across borders. We now live in a world where 93% of the world's population live in countries that have imposed new border restrictions over the last couple of months. We do not know when those border restrictions are going to be lifted, how they are going to be lifted, and which border restrictions might stay in place. 1/3 of the population of the world is currently under lockdown, so we've moved from a world of some migration to a world of immobility. And Piccoli suggests that as we move back, perhaps as the coronavirus restrictions begin to be lifted, that even under this world, we are likely to see that asylum seekers, that undocumented migrants, others are likely to face much more serious risks than many people, because they are going to be less likely to be able to move and more likely to be at risk if they cannot move. So we might think about this from the perspective of the different approaches that we have talked about. If you are a nationalist, you obviously are, if you're a strong nationalist at least, you're going to be skeptical about asylum seekers and undocumented migrants being able to move. If you are a libertarian, you might you might possibly be prepared to want to have some restrictions on migration, as long as you felt that there was a risk to the health of citizens and the ability of citizens to engage in peaceful economic exchange among each other in a world of coronavirus lockdowns. You might be prepared to support substantial border restrictions that you might not have been prepared to support in the past. And if you are a cosmopolitan like Joe Cairns, you might instead think that you possibly want to have a rapid move back towards easier borders and past that to relatively free migration, because the people who are most important to your analysis are the people who are worst off, who are the asylum seekers, the undocumented migrants, and others, and these are the people who are likely to suffer the most under continued border restrictions. So, what does this all tell us about normative theories? First, I should be clear, you aren't going to be able to get to simple answers to complex questions by having normative theories. This is not something that they are particularly good at doing. They help instead to clarify debates rather than to resolve them. Which position you begin from in this debate, whether you see yourself as having one set of ethical obligations to one set of actors, or a different set of ethical obligations to a different set of actors, how strong or how weak the ethical obligations you think ought to be. All of these questions are in effect questions which are impossible to resolve. using these kinds of analyses, but what you can do is to clarify them. You can use them to think more clearly about the specific implications that different positions might have, the weak points that they might have in dealing with certain kinds of questions, the challenges that they might throw up if you are confronted with a situation like the one that we are in the moment. So ethical considerations are crucial in world politics. They have big consequences. We don't have any very specific, strong answers to offer. We do instead have a set of debates where at least people who disagree with each other can help to better clarify their own arguments, and as people are wont to do, can be much better at identifying the flaws in their opponent's arguments than the flaws in their own. So thank you very much all for listening to this, and we will resume with a final lecture next week. Thank you.